You're kneeling in sand. Your knees burn. The iron collar around your neck is so tight you can barely swallow. The chain connects you to 11 other women. You can hear them breathing, some crying, one praying in a language you don't recognize. A man's shadow blocks the sun. Relief from the heat for half a second. Then hands grab your jaw, force your mouth open. Fingers press against your teeth, your gums, the back of your throat. You gag. He doesn't stop. He checks your tongue for disease, examines your eyes, pulls down your lip like you're a horse at auction, because that's exactly what you are now. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a village chief in the Sahel. 12 days ago, you had a mother who called your name every morning. She's dead now. You watched it happen, and you kept walking because the men with swords made it clear. Stop moving. Join her. In Arabic, they have a word for what you become. Jaria. It means slave girl. But that translation is too clean, too soft. It hides what the word really means. What it really means is your body is merchandise now. Your future is whatever a buyer decides to do with it. Your past no longer exists. The man examining you steps back, nods to another man holding a leather pouch. Coins change hands. You've just been sold for the 3rd time this month. And the place they're taking you, historians would spend centuries trying to pretend it never existed. This is the Arab slave trade. 14 million Africans. Hayata, 300 years. A system so effective at erasing human beings that almost no descendants survived to tell the story. If this history matters to you, drop a like and subscribe. Crown and Dagger doesn't hide from the stories the world tried to bury. You know about the Atlantic slave trade, ships, chains, plantations in America. 12 million Africans transported across the ocean over 400 years. That history has museums, monuments, movies. Children learn about it in school. Politicians give speeches about it. But there was another slave trade, older, longer, and by some measures even larger. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam and the Arab conquest that spread across North Africa. It didn't end until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962, Mauritania in 1981. These aren't dates from ancient history. These are dates your grandparents remember. There are people alive today who were born into societies where this trade still operated legally. Between 650 AD and 1900 AD, somewhere between 14 and 17 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported to the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians argue the true number is even higher because records were inconsistent and countless deaths went undocumented. More people over a longer period through routes that stretched across 3 continents. Yet almost no one talks about it. Why? Because this slave trade was designed to leave no trace. And it succeeded. In America today, there are 45 million people of African descent, living proof of what happened. Their existence keeps the memory alive. Their struggles for equality ensure the history is never forgotten. In the Middle East, after 300 years of importing millions of Africans, almost nothing. Small communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand Afro-Arabs in Morocco, tiny remnants where there should be millions. Where did 14 million people go? The answer is the darkest part of this story. The men were castrated. This is not theory. This is documented across hundreds of primary sources spanning multiple centuries. Arab slave traders systematically castrated African males at rates between 80 and 90%. The procedure was performed at specific points along the trade routes. Egyptian monasteries became notorious for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly improved survival rates. Slightly. For every man who survived castration, somewhere between 3 and 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some sources suggest even higher mortality. Think about that math. If a trader needed 100 living eunuchs to sell a market, he might start with 400 or 500 men. The rest died screaming in the sand. The economics were brutal but logical. Castrated slaves couldn't reproduce, couldn't form families, couldn't create communities that might grow strong enough to resist, couldn't leave descendants who might one day demand freedom. They worked, they aged, they died, and they were replaced with fresh captives from the next raid, generation after generation for 300 years. But the women served a different function entirely. They were kept intact, kept fertile, kept specifically because of what their bodies could produce. And what happened to them is a story that historical records tell only in careful euphemisms, in silences between words, in details that writers of the time considered too indelicate to describe directly. The machine required constant feeding. Arab merchants weren't raiders themselves. They were businessmen operating sophisticated commercial networks that spanned continents. They didn't attack villages personally. Instead, they created economic systems that incentivized Africans to capture and sell each other. Guns flowed into the continent. European firearms traded through Arab middlemen. Textiles, luxury goods, salt, which was precious in sub-Saharan regions. And in exchange for these goods, human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey in what is now Benin became one of the major suppliers. The kingdom's economy grew dependent on annual slave raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African trade routes. The Funj Sultanate of Sudan dominated the Nile corridor. Various Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan routes. African kingdoms waged war on their neighbors, not for territory, but for human merchandise. Captured survivors were marched to collection points and sold to Arab traders. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More guns meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant more purchasing power. More purchasing power meant more guns. A machine that fed on human misery and grew stronger with every life it consumed. Villages were attacked at dawn when resistance was weakest. Warriors surrounded settlements while people slept. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Men who resisted were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were evaluated on the spot. Age, health, strength. Young, strong men were separated for castration and sale. Older men with no market value were frequently killed where they stood, but the women faced different calculations entirely. Traders examined them with specific criteria in mind. Age mattered enormously. Girls too young would require years of feeding before becoming useful. Women too old had diminished value. The ideal range was roughly 13 to 25 years old. Old enough to survive the brutal journey ahead. Young enough for decades of use. Physical appearance affected price dramatically. Arab markets had specific preferences that experienced traders knew intimately. Certain body types, certain features. Different markets preferred different characteristics. Ethiopian women commanded premium prices across almost all markets. Their features were considered particularly desirable. They might sell a double or a triple what women from other regions brought. Women who met desirable criteria were separated immediately. They'd receive marginally better treatment during transport, not from compassion, never from compassion. Damaged merchandise sold for less. Protecting the investment made economic sense. The separation of families happened at capture sites or collection points. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers. The bonds of a lifetime severed in moments with no hope of reunion. European explorers and missionaries who witnessed these separations left accounts describing scenes of unimaginable grief. The screaming, the desperate clinging as families try to hold on to each other for a few more seconds. The final moments of contact before chains were pulled tight and people who had loved each other, their entire lives were dragged in opposite directions, never to meet again, never to know what happened to each other. One missionary wrote that the sounds haunted his dreams for years afterward, that he could still hear the mothers calling for their children decades later, that no matter how far he traveled or how much time passed, those screams followed him. Those screams echoed across Africa for 1,300 years, and almost no one in the outside world heard them. Then came the Sahara. The trans-Saharan routes were journeys measured not in miles, but in death. Picture the distance from New York to Denver. Now imagine walking in chains with almost no water under a sun that kills. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa to the great markets of North Africa, Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakech. Caravans traveled distances exceeding 7,500 m. Some routes stretched over 2,000 m. The journey took 2 to 3 months under optimal conditions. Conditions were never optimal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand becomes so hot it blisters skin on contact. Shade doesn't exist for hundreds of miles. Then night falls and the temperature plummets. The same desert that broiled you during the day can drop below freezing after dark. The temperature swing alone killed countless people. Water was the most precious resource, and it was rationed with brutal calculation. Camels needed water to survive. Camels were expensive. Camels were essential for carrying goods. Slaves were cheaper than camels. Slaves were replaceable. So slaves received whatever water remained after the animals drank. Lips cracking until they bled. Tongue swelling. The maddening knowledge that there was nothing to drink and hundreds of miles of burning sand still ahead. Food was minimal. Dried dates. Sometimes meat. Enough calories to keep legs moving. Never enough to maintain health over months of walking. The mortality rates were catastrophic. Historians estimate that 20 to 30% of slaves died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half their human cargo. There are accounts of caravans arriving with more than 60% losses. Those who collapsed were left where they fell. Stopping to bury bodies would slow the caravan. Stopping to help the dying might mean losing the living. The economics didn't support compassion. People were abandoned alive, too weak to walk further, left sitting in the sand as the caravan moved on, waiting to die. So the routes became marked by bones. Heinrich Bath, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, documented what he witnessed. The road was literally strewn with awi skeletons. In some valleys, the bones were so numerous that one could hardly avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These weren't ancient remains. They were recent, fresh additions to trails that had been accumulating bodies for over 1,000 years. Rene Kiley documented similar horrors on western routes. He described valleys that appeared white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustav Nachtigall wrote of passing through regions where skulls and bones gave the sand an almost pavement-like quality underfoot. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over 13 centuries. Their remains scattered across the world's largest desert, marking the paths that swallowed them. Silent testimony to a trade the world chose to ignore. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the heat and cold and thirst and starvation. Arrival at a North African port meant only that the immediate dying had stopped, but survival came at a cost. Many arrived broken in ways that didn't show on the surface. Their bodies had made the journey. Their spirits had not. Their ordeal wasn't over. It was transforming into something else. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions refined over centuries into operations of terrifying efficiency. Cairo's market had operated continuously for over 1,000 years by the time European observers began documenting it. Generation after generation of traders had refined the practices, the pricing, the techniques of evaluation. Buyers came from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy Arabs from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf states seeking domestic servants, even European buyers, despite official prohibitions, found ways to participate. The markets were organized by category. Common laborers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic servants in a third, and behind screens in the most exclusive areas, the women intended for private sale. The examination process was systematic and thorough. Teeth first. Dental health indicated age and condition. Experienced buyers could estimate remaining years of useful life from teeth alone. Then skin examined for disease, scars, imperfections. Hair checked for texture and length, then the rest. Buyers paying premium prices demanded thorough evaluation. The examinations were intimate, invasive, conducted with a detachment a butcher might show when evaluating livestock. European travelers left accounts so graphic their publishers often censored them. One British observer in the 1830s wrote, "The women are made to walk, to turn, to display themselves in ways that cannot be described in polite company. The buyers examine them as a horseman examines a mare with identical cold calculation and complete absence of human feeling. Prices varied based on origin, appearance, and intended use. Common women sold for modest sums. Women with desirable features brought significantly more. Young virgins from preferred backgrounds could sell for the equivalent of several years' wages. The highest prices were paid privately by agents representing the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its peak, 50,000 slaves passed through annually. The island's entire economy revolved around human merchandise. David Livingstone witnessed the trade firsthand. His accounts helped galvanize British abolition efforts. What he saw change him forever. He wrote, "To overdraw its evils is simply impossible. The subject does not admit of exaggeration. The sights I have seen are so revolting that I always strive to drive them from memory." The market operated openly until 1873, when British pressure finally forced its closure. The Sultan signed a treaty. The auctions officially ended, but the trade continued underground for decades afterward. Ships sailed at night. Transactions happened in hidden locations. The demand was too strong, the profits too large. Where there is demand, supply finds a way. Where did these women go after they were sold? The answer depended entirely on who bought them and what they were bought for. The wealthiest buyers were building harems. Ottoman sultans maintained harems with hundreds of women, sometimes thousands. The imperial harem at Topkapi Palace in Constantinople held up to 2,000 women at various points in history. Lesser nobles and provincial governors kept smaller collections proportional to their wealth. Even moderately wealthy merchants might own several women for domestic and personal purposes. The harem was more complex than the word suggests today. It wasn't merely about physical gratification. It was a political institution where women competed for favor. Bearing a son to a powerful man could mean everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded enormous power. So women schemed, formed alliances, undermined rivals. Poison was common. Political maneuvering, as sophisticated as anything in the formal court, took place behind her walls. For a captured African woman, entering a harem meant systematic erasure of everything she had been. She received a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Her past was destroyed and rebuilt. Trainers taught her new customs, behaviors, expectations, how to walk, how to serve, what was permitted and punished. Eventually, nothing remained of who she had been. The person her family loved was gone, replaced by someone created to serve her owners. Some women navigated this successfully. A rare few achieved genuine power. Kosum Sultan dominated Ottoman politics for decades. She began life as a slave girl captured from a small Greek village. Hürrem Sultan became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an almost unheard-of achievement for a former slave. But these were exceptions so extraordinary that history records their names precisely because they were unusual. For every Kosem, thousands lived and died anonymous, used until no longer useful, then discarded. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different circumstances. Many became domestic servants with additional obligations. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and submitted whenever their owner desired. There was no concept of consent, no option to refuse. Islamic law technically provided some protections for slave women who became mothers. A slave who bore her master's child was called a muwallad, mother of a child. She couldn't be sold afterward. Her child was born legally free. When her master died, she would gain her freedom. But these protections required enforcement. Reality was inconsistent, and protections only applied after pregnancy. Before that, she was property. Children born from these unions were legally free, often acknowledged. Some achieved prominence. Multiple sultans were sons of slave mothers, but the mothers remained slaves unless explicitly freed. Whatever intimacy occurred was compelled, not chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Their features blended, their African heritage diluted with each new generation until it became invisible, until it vanished completely. This was a final eraser, not just of individuals, but of their descendants. not just of lives, but of any evidence those lives had ever existed. The final eraser, not just of individuals, but of their descendants until no trace remained. If you're still here, hit subscribe. This story isn't over. The Arab slave trade didn't end with a dramatic abolition. There was no Emancipation Proclamation, no civil war fought over it, no moment when the world rose up and declared it finished. Instead, it faded slowly, reluctantly, under external pressure rather than internal moral awakening. British naval power gradually closed East African routes in the late 1800s. The Royal Navy actively hunted slave ships. Colonial administration suppressed trans-Saharan trade as European powers carved up Africa. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. But the legacy isn't monuments or memorials. The legacy is absence. In the Middle East today, there are virtually no descendants of the 14 million taken there. The men were castrated. The women's children were absorbed into Arab populations. Their heritage diluted until it disappeared. The victims vanished so completely that most people don't know they existed. No movies have been made about them. No holidays commemorate their suffering. No politicians give speeches in their memory. In 2020, archaeologists in Libya discovered a mass grave, hundreds of remains. Analysis revealed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly slaves who never finished the crossing, who collapsed and were left behind while the caravan moved on. They had no names in any record, no descendants to claim them, no one anywhere in the world who remembered they had ever lived, no grave markers, no memorials, no one to mourn them, just bones in the desert, silent evidence of a tragedy the world chose to forget. The Atlantic slave trade left 45 million descendants who ensure history is never forgotten. The Arab slave trade left silence. Nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely that we don't have their names. The woman in the market, the one whose teeth were examined, whose body was evaluated, whose humanity was stripped away one inspection at a time. We will never know what she was called before they took her name, the name her mother gave her, the name her village knew her by. She might have ended up in a Cairo here competing with dozens of other women for scraps of attention from a man who owned her. She might have ended up in a Baghdad household cooking and cleaning and submitting whenever called. She might have ended up in a palace in Istanbul, forgotten in a corner when her youth faded. She might have borne children who never learned her original language, who never heard her songs, who never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others, marking the roots that civilization has tried to forget. What we know is that she existed. She suffered. She endured things that no human being should ever endure. And for 300 years, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. The Atlantic slave trade has monuments, museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This history has sand covering bones that no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a number, not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter, someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before they erased it. That's the only memorial these 14 million will ever receive. This is Crown and Dagger. We don't sanitize history. We show you what actually happened. If the story mattered to you, drop a like. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what other buried history should we uncover.